Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to those audience in Europe, and good evening to our audience in the Southeast Asia. Thank you all for joining me in the second edition of the TAP series, Talks on Architecture and Beyond. And for the audience joining us for the first time, welcome to the TAP family. And long story short, this year TAP series is about the making of architecture and the notion of time. Within this context, we aim to highlight the importance of working towards a more conscious architecture. How to be better, how to be more sustainable, and how to design more resilient spaces. Because these statements are very much related with Cosentino. Our company is a global leader manufacturing innovative and sustainable surfaces for the architecture and design industry, but we just don't stop there. As a cutting-edge company, we feel that we do have the responsibility to promote knowledge, education, and foster the critical thinking to create a better society and a more sustainable world. And this platform is precisely meant to be for that purpose. With that series, we want to empower the architecture and design community in the Southeast Asia, but also to open this platform as a communication tool to the public in general, students, industry professionals, non-industry professionals, in order to enhance the knowledge of related to the A&D sector. We want to serve as an inspirational source aligned with our core values and pledge to help to build a better place for the next generations. Because protect the environment is one of our more important commitments. It's in our DNA to work for a more sustainable future. So after this short introduction, I will give the floor to Yann, the curator of TAP series. And well, Yann, welcome again. Today we are live in the showroom, and let us know what is coming in this second quarter with a new theme.
Okay, so it's my turn, so I can remove my mask. So first of all, I'm full of emotion today. It's a big day because it's been more than a year that we couldn't do such events live with people in real life. And so it's a very special day for me to be back in the Cosentino city in Singapore with our family, Maria and the team that is behind. You don't see on screen, but there is a whole team behind there. And thanks also to the team in Spain for coordinating all of that from a technical standpoint and to make today possible. Thanks also to all of the efforts from Singapore that has been done for more than a year to contribute to this kind of community making where we can be together again. So, I'm like full of emotions. I will try to focus a bit on the talk today because I have an amazing speaker in front of me. So the TAP series is, as Maria was mentioning, it is celebrating architecture and beyond. We started in 2019, and this year, 2021, it is the second iteration, and this year is pretty particular. We have experienced a pandemic during 2020. It's still happening around the world. It's highly difficult. And so that's why it is a moment where we want to slow down and to rethink architecture, to look again at what we've been doing so far and to understand that architecture takes time to do. And that's why along this year, we are dissecting the process, the making of architecture. We were with concept and ideas for the first quarter. Now we are in the design development, and it was pretty evident for me to invite someone that I sincerely admire for his work, for what he's doing, for the level of innovation that he's pushing and across many different disciplines. So I will take my phone for the different notes that I have. So today we have Fan. From Singaporean architect, and so that he will be sharing with us his practice, his vision of architecture. And you might not know necessarily his architecture practice, but you might know his design practice, and he received many awards for that. But his architecture company is TypeO Architecture. But Pan is also the director and the founder of Produce and Superstructure, and these three studios are set up not only to support architectural and material experimentation, but also to address the urgent needs of the contemporary built environment, which is exactly what Cosentino is also doing. So, of course, he won multiple awards with all of the different projects that he's been doing in the past. And today, he will be sharing with us parametric phenomenology. And that, like many people contact me, like, what does that mean? What is this like highly philosophical, spiritual terminology? And so I try to simplify a little bit the content. So parametric phenomenology attempts to unify the diametric themes of technology and emotion by defining the basic element of materials and nature. Parametric system can be formed to generate technological models that impact our emotional and spatial perception of the space. So that's what we'll be discovering today. So Pan, the floor is yours, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Thanks again for being here today, and thanks to our audience for being here physically in the show of Cosentino. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Yann, for inviting me to kick off the second edition. I feel very honored, and that's why I'm going to test out a theory that I am trying to come up with over a period of 4 years at least. After seeing a body of work that we have done, we thought it would be time to maybe test it out with our community. So just a little bit of background of my company. We started in 2013 as a design studio with a workshop. The entire idea was to model it after a school. Like any other architectural school, we have a facility to experiment and make mistakes, and we find that that would be the most conducive way of working or producing architecture. So this combination of a hybrid of a studio and a workshop has been our modus operandi for a while now, and of late we started Superstructure. Superstructure is a digital fabrication workshop that is an extension of what we had already started to build up and produce, and now we have a series of precision machines from 5-axis CNC, 3-axis CNC, laser cutters, and 3D printers. So architecture is not without its different dialects as a language, and TypeO is very interested in formulating its own language by, first of all, looking at its diverse, wide-ranging language that are available already in architecture. And then as a community, as an association of companies, we want to kind of find the confluence and create a union between the disparate parts of architectural thought. Today, I shall be attempting to pull together two very seemingly opposite terms. Parametricism is very scientific, whereas phenomenology, as Yann mentioned, is kind of spiritual, very subjective. So you would have to forgive me if I may not sound coherent. But things started when I first built my own building. This was when I was still in the army at the age of maybe 20. Was down in the forest for 5 days in a survival training, and we had to build a number of structures. So this, it was my first building, and I can't, when I progress in my architecture career, I have always to look back at this point. And I think I can learn a lot from my beginnings. As a primitive hut, I think as I study architecture, I learned about the loggia hut and kind of create a comparison. The loggia hut was almost a harmony between nature and man's activity, namely architecture. And it seems like a natural progression that architecture would be learned, developed from nature. But is that so? because actually when I was building my primitive hut back in the Brunei jungle, we create a lot more devastation than any harmony with nature. I mean, first of all, we were there for an exercise, so we exploited whatever was there, harvest what we may not necessarily need. And the kind of guilt that I have for changing and permanently creating a temporary damage to that forest or the jungle stayed with me. So this became a theme that I started to explore, looking at existence of how architecture comes into existence, whether it is actually human nature versus nature itself. And that's a theme that I would hope to address going forward. So I would like to consider two very disparate theories about nature. Phenomenology on the left is on the basis that nature is outside of architecture, that the whole point of architecture was a kind of conduit to understand human nature itself. Whereas typology is a nature embedded within architectural thought and architectural production. So these are two things that I have been toying with. My own background will be more on the scientific part of the typology, but I find that the subjective notion of architecture is increasingly more relevant these days. So phenomenology in architecture attempts to create conditions through material and elements of nature for the objective study of topics usually regarded as subjective, such as consciousness, judgment, perceptions, and emotion. So architecture is like almost like a medium that helps you sharpen your senses, your perception, and therefore you create your own identification and perhaps get a kind of metaphysical foothold. And this can be done in few ways. We can look at the masters of this branch of thought. Louis Kahn, one of the main figure, and he famously asked a brick, what do you want, brick? A brick says to you, I like an arch. So if you say to brick, arches are expensive and I can use concrete lintel over an opening, what do you think of that brick? And the brick says, I like an arch. So in this short question, he suggests three things. That one, that there is an inherent formal tendency of a given material. Architecture is, number two, architecture is created by bringing about the full potential of a material. And number three, the experience of architecture is very related to the essence, the very essence of the material itself. So, however, I feel that it is not self-evident that a material tends toward any form, and we may simply be subscribing to preconceptions and identifications of Louis Kahn himself. So, perhaps we need to suspend our preconception and perhaps not use it as a generative way of producing architecture. So, in comparison, I find the work of Zumthor, particularly in this chapel, very fascinating, because it is not the outcome of architecture that he is expressing, but the entire process of the formation of this building. So if you do not know, this building was actually made of ramp earth, and the lost forms in there are made of these logs which are then burnt after the ramp earth has been cast on the outside. So what I find really interesting is that he tried to express a process rather than a single outcome, where you have two materials, the logs, the burnt logs, and the ramp earth interacting with each other. And the outcome is self-evident that the absence of one becomes the generator for the other. And when you look at a building like that, you immediately will be able to create certain emotions within yourself. And I find that at first, if you think of this as a way of suspending emotional thought in generating an architecture, but by looking at material itself, then the emotional attachment and outcome becomes something interesting, something that is found And that's something that I find really, really interesting. So, so how do you discover the essence of a material? I look towards more of my background, which is in architectural typology. In architectural typology, maybe it's really the origins of parametric thinking. We can trace it back to Durand, who cataloged a series of buildings. So you take for granted that maybe this series of building accumulated over time, the similar type of building accumulated over time, has already is already imbued with man's relationship with nature. And then by combination of this series, you could form new experiences or new building types. And that to me is the kind of methodology of architecture where you can actually produce, reproduce and repeat certain thoughts and knowledge that you gain in architecture. And there's no preconception or emotions involved in this generation, but simply by looking at the deep structure of a certain series of buildings. So going forward, then that became a way of generating architecture. So architecture then as a process is more and more linked to a kind of breeding process in biology. And in this book by Richard Dawkins, The Blind Watchmaker, he talks about, he made an experiment using a very simple structure, which is a branching structure, and then looking at its essence, its main attribute that would differentiate this main model of a branch. And you can then create 9 parameters in there, either by varying the angle, varying the length, and so on and so forth. And then by a series of generative process and elimination, he arrives at completely unrecognizable models and develop a huge range of differentiated forms that bears almost very little resemblance to the original branch, but yet it is actually born out of the main attributes, the essence of that deep structure. So that continued forward, and I think more recently in FOA's phylogenetic tree, it talks about the recombination of materials or material surfaces in order to generate new forms. So if one feels that the material, through certain kind of combination, has an inherent form, but yet we find that it is based on his preconception of the material, then could we explore the beginnings of the material? So I think in this day and age, we can go beyond the material as a component, but really look into the material construct itself, looking at it from a granular point of view and studying its attributes from a cellular perspective, and then identifying its natural performance, or teasing out certain performances or behaviors that are not immediately visible. And for that, we will then increase our knowledge, increase our perception of what the material can actually do. And this will then give us a lot more catalog of material properties that then generate forms. So this is a working title and therefore a working definition of what parametric phenomenology would be. In my view, a generative process of production through differentiating parameters of material as a reason for being. So it is in itself kind of self-referential, but at the same time, it's trying to create meaning for itself. So I'll just go through some of the projects which I'm trying to frame under this combination of these two terms. Fabric Wood started in 2012 as a project. It was meant for Extra, which is a furniture showroom, and Herman Miller was one of their most important brands that they carry, and they wanted to create kind of a flagship appearance. And we all know that Herman Miller is a 100-year-old brand and has a wide range of products designed by a wide range of designers as well. So if a brand is like a person, what would be Herman Miller's ethos? That was something that we needed to find out. So we can look at all the different furniture that they carry, and we discovered two very important moments. One was the Eames molded plywood series, where they used the leg spleens used for supporting injured soldiers in the Second World War and turned it into a product that can then be mass produced. You know, at the time, before that, most furniture would be in solid timber. And then in the 70s, they moved almost entirely away and then moved into the ergonomic series, which is work chairs. And here, again, looking at the new modes of production, creating a kit of parts that can then be produced in a dispersed manner and then recombined. And so we wanted to kind of combine the spirit of the two. If this person has two histories, and then we want to find what would that person be like, we want to combine the two most distinctive moments in their life. So we wanted to create a structure made of plywood, but definitely we would not be able to mold it in such a large scale. Therefore, we was looking at a geometrical method to recombine, to combine flat pieces of plywood without nails or screws. And we went through a series of tests, you know, just varying it little by little with little small change. And that's kind of an iterative loop that kind of feeds back until we arrive at a triangulated model that can then be hooked together. So it's a double layered surface prop apart, and it has its own natural geometrical rules that we use then to wrap around the existing space of extra. And then this creates a catalog of its kind of kit of parts, let's say, that we can then try to put them back together. So the entire process is about almost creating a new brick, if you like. And this brick, with our new processes, we are able to differentiate them. So when things are put on a CNC bed, they can be cut in minute differences, and that helps to create a natural form from combining them back together. So the panels are all labeled and has a specific position in the overall form, and the process is really like putting up a brick wall. So it's a really lightweight structure, but yet it's really it's quite strong. This structure was there for more than 4 years until 2016, before Park Mall was demolished, and they had to move to a new premise in Marina Square. So the previous option, the previous iteration was consists of 4,000 over modules. So that was a bit tedious to assemble. So the second time around, Extra told me to reduce the number of parts. So we revisited how timber can bend. It is singular directional in terms of the grain flow. So to bend it, you either kind of adhere it to a frame traditionally, or using heat press. Again, we avoid this too, and we relook at how Herman Miller chairs wrap around the body. And there's none other method that is more able to wrap around the body than tailoring. So we tried to learn from tailoring, which is a process of removal of material and then stitching it back together to create different topographies. And then we try to export that onto plywood. So this is our very first test. You can see that it creates valleys, knolls, and double curvature surfaces. And we find that we could then perhaps abstract these different moments on this topography and then assign them specifically to a particular form. So then this iterative loop goes between digital simulation and physical modeling. Every time we try to increase the degrees of the slit by a little bit more to find out its relationship between the angle of the slit and the final deformation. So this becomes the kind of parameter, let's say, or the DNA of this particular system, which is about tailoring plywood. And it's specific to the makeup of the plywood. In this case, we are using a 3-ply plywood, and the total thickness was only 2 millimeters. So if I have to change the constitution of the plywood, then this graph will also need to adjust. But what is interesting is also that then our drawings became much more like a tailoring flat pattern. It kind of changed our workflow. And the way we produce it, we did not need any special skill. So the slits are simply sewn together with cable ties. They are propped together with pegs apart. And then to combine the panels together, we use pop rivet so that we can access it from the outside. So again, we created a lot of iterations, and one can think of this as wastage, but at the same time, they actually branch off into different areas of research or different models that we can then carry on as a studio. So it's a way of generating knowledge within our studio. So the litmus test was actually to create a one-to-one mock-up going from a vertical surface to a horizontal surface. And once we kind of achieve that, we believe that then we could then adapt that to any site constraint. The site was a shock when we saw the site, because actually we were developing the system without the site. And then when we saw the site, it was almost 9 meters high on the window side, and then it plunges down to 3 meters at where the entrance is. And that was a big challenge. So we look at what would then naturally be a formal, if the technique and the material has a natural form, then what could the most optimum form be? And so we look into this bubble, soap film bubble, which was experimented by Fryoto, and creating a minimal surface. And we thought that then a timber scheme should also be able to describe as a minimal surface. So again, the next thing we do would then jump back to digital simulation to create that minimal surface, and it's then laid out as 400 distinct panels. So a lot less than what we originally had before. Structurally, the way we construct it is also something very much like a tensile structure. You see here in the background that the timber membrane is being pulled up by ropes, and then you will see these steel arches, and they basically are performing like hangers that would then hang off the timber membrane. And the way we put it together is really like pulling up the sail. So the way we construct it has also changed. It's very akin to way you treat fabric. So the final outcome, we have students from different schools from different subjects. They graduated and they were looking for a job, and we got them to just stitch them together before we then hang it up onto the structure. And from start to finish, we only took 6 weeks from cutting all the way to the end of installation. So it's actually a lot more efficient, and the material use is very, very little. And so here I said that we suspend emotional judgment of the material, or emotion or certain preconception of the material, and try to find its main attribute and then look at it as outcome. So here, after it's done, we start to hear a lot of different description about it. Some people think of it as a cave. Some people think of it as a bazaar. They almost tent-like structure overhead, very casually placed. And some people say that it's quite a distinct comparison or contrast to the expensive furniture in that space. But we welcome all of these experiences. And to us, this system could then have a lot more potential. Currently, we are looking at this as an acoustic panel that can then be used to fit out offices or interior spaces. And at one point, we were also thinking of this as a formwork where we can spray concrete on and use it outdoor. So the kind of emotional attachment to it then can extend if we change the material or combine other materials with the same system. So other than this project, we also were involved in some temporary structures, more temporary. This is only for 2 weeks. It was for Singapore at the Singapore Design Festival in 2018, a central pavilion which was in collaboration with Formica. Formica is an American company selling HPL laminates. And normally it is adhered onto a substrate, plywood. And so we looked at the property of this plywood, which is kind of strengthened by laminate. And we were wondering, you know, it's almost like an eggshell. What can we do about it? So we turned that into strips that kind of can twist slightly and develop a kind of basket structure that is kind of turned upside down with simulated gravity in the digital workflow. So our process always starts with experimentation on a 1-to-1 scale and skips between digital and the real. And we will always also create a 1-to-1 mock-up to learn from the assembly process. And then it kind of go back in an iterative loop to refine our assembly process. Actually, we started with 3 layers, and we realized that it's strong enough just to be 2 layers. And eventually it was built just with 2 layers, and the entire assembly only took 3 days. The amount of material used was less than a pallet. And it was a relatively strong structure. And before we tore it down, I personally climbed onto this structure. So another project I would like to show is for Alien Foundation. It's a philanthropic company that creates ideas through publications, looking at elder care, early childhood education, and other important social facilities that will enrich the community. So the way they work is that they create publications, and they're almost like a think tank. So we wanted to fill up the space with kind of paper-thin scroll, and they need different cells. So because some of them work in elder care, some of them work in early childhood, and they need a place that is open plan yet allowing people to congregate in different cells for discussion. So in order to create something thin, we need something that almost to be self-supporting, and then this is relaxed as a vault, a continuous ribbon-like vault, and it needs to be an acoustic panel as well. So how do we make something that has so many functions, almost paper thin in terms of its proportion? We look into masonry shells using bricks, and try to also then learn from that and use that on plywood. We often use plywood because of the tools that we have. We kind of sometimes really the tools are facilitating us in our experimentation, and whatever is readily available, we tend to use them for experiments. So we started with finger grooves, finger joints, but there's too much tolerance. And because we wanted it thin, we will not be able to put in like long screws to tighten them. And we gradually moved to this edge-wise fastening system where it was using our five-axis cutter precisely cut to the exact angle where then the modules are clamped together. So it's always in compression. So finally, they are pre-assembled in our factory. And then the way we put it up is very simple. They go up column by column. And it would, you can see that without much temporary structure, it is already forming the shape very, very close to what we have modeled out in computer space. So the outcome was then an acoustic panel using felt material on the inside, and the outside is expressed as plywood. So this creates an open plan office where the cellular structure and identity is very much intact. And this very lightweight, almost paper thin in terms of its proportion, space becomes something that becomes a system that we can then use for other projects. More recently, we use it as a quiet pod in a museum where they are open up to students of special needs. They can then temporarily hide inside these quiet pods. So lastly, I just want to conclude with one last project that we are working on. Because we have been working on so much timber, we wanted to move up to an architectural scale. And to me, whatever we have accumulated in terms of experience in computational design surrounding timber, we'll find its natural progression in mass engineered timber. But we are, as a small practice, we are not able to already import in MET from Europe. So we looked regionally for what might be possible to use as MET. So this reconstituted timber is used, it's created using plantation timber that are fast growing. They are shredded into fibers and then recombined and using heat press to create a very, very dense material. So it's relatively strong. It's almost like casting wood. So we wanted to then explore that by using topological optimization to allow structures or material to be concentrated where it is required. So if we have points that are moving, this column points, vertical load transfer that are moving about, then the material will reorganize to be concentrated around them. And the way that floor slab will be put up will be in parts. So we created a first test before the lockdown, and it was there for about 2 weeks in Marina Bay Sands during Art Expo. So this was actually done through milling out, so it's subtractive, but going forward we will be looking at an additive method to press this wood into shape like this. And we are also doing that already with a grant from Design Singapore. We're looking at creating standard panels for walls and floor that could replace precast concrete panels. We wanted to champion timber as a construction method, primarily because it's the only renewable building material we know. The rest of them depletes the earth in terms of resources. But with timber and with proper management, it could be sequestering a lot of carbon away from our atmosphere. So we studied the properties of this 8-crate structure that would then be sandwiched between two pieces of reconstituted timber. And we form 2 modules, one for wall on the left and the other one for a double-way floor slab. double span floor slab. And currently we have gone through some load testing and just going to have a proof of concept building a simple shed, just made entirely of these modules. So to conclude, we thought that our research into integration of advanced computational tool and digital fabrication allow us to maybe suspend any judgment or preconceptions and pose perhaps deeper questions to the brick. Maybe we can ask the brick, what is your essential attribute? What are the different organizational strategies I can use? And how to optimize your aggregation within the laws of nature? And then can I turn you into a system for different elements of architecture? So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Pan. So, okay, I'm on the right. I'm on the right camera. So thanks a lot. I took a lot of notes actually. So there are many questions. I don't know if I have received yet some other questions. So feel free to forward me the questions that might have come through the Q&A. So okay, we'll try to formalize a little bit the different questions, but you talked about CAN, you talked about IMS, and Zumthor as well. But what about Buckminster Fuller?
Oh, yeah.
When I see your work, the first architect and designer and engineer that comes to mind is Buckminster Fuller. So are you inspired by Buckminster Fuller?
Definitely, but I would maybe lean more towards his contemporary, which is Frei Otto, where the experimental process was actually more extensive, very systematically cataloged. So I look to them as definitely my contemporaries, but those are things I'm familiar with. I come from very technocratic upbringing, you know, and then what I studied at the AA was also more scientific. So reaching out to the other hour, where it is the subjective notion of architecture that seems to be the driver for these people like Zumthor, Louis Kahn. I always feel intrigued, and I personally like the buildings that they do. My problem is, as an educator and as a practitioner, you cannot teach another Zumthor. Like, you cannot create another Zumthor. So I'm curious about how do we repeat such processes, if there is any? How do we create a process? And then maybe how do we use it to generate and develop new experiences? In
that, because you say that you studied at the AA, did it have an impact in your, like, through your formative years?
Yeah.
Did it have an impact on the way that you are practicing, exploring, pushing the boundaries of the built environment?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. So I actually would say that I majored more in the urban design and typological thought of things, but it has its origins, right, in a very systematic taxonomical approach. The AA has a very wide spectrum in terms of its architectural processes and discourse. So I tend to, jump around units, listen to their lectures or their presentations. So I always thought that we could marry this different poles of architectural thought. In typology, we talk about parameters that builds up a building. What is the deep structure? And then the building, in combination, builds up the city. So there is always something constituent or an attribute to the other. So here, when I practiced in Singapore, when I came back to Singapore, I don't get to work on large projects anymore. So I imported that process into material. So what is constituent to a plywood? What is constituent to a quartz panel, for example? And then those things will be interesting to me because I'm actually following the same process. Yeah.
And in that, I have experienced your creation. I've been to Extra. I've been to the most recent one as well. I saw the one in the NDC. They are breathtaking. When you enter into the space, when you see it, it generates a certain emotion. And that's very difficult to generate. So, especially when you do something that is so parametric, so which is exactly the purpose of your talk today. But were you expecting such emotion from people? And you shared that a little bit with people see it as a kind of a tentage or a soup, something like this. So was that expected when you received such feedback, or were you surprised by the level of emotion that people were having in the space?
Yeah, actually, to be very honest, I was very pleasantly surprised because at that time, this whole subjectivity didn't really come into picture. So at that moment on, people say that my work has this kind of in between the gray zone between craft and technology, and that to me was surprising and interesting. Maybe it was not a perfect model, and that's why there's some mistakes in there all the time, and that's why it's craft, it looks almost handmade. These are comments that I get, and I think for me it's a stage of discovering this responses and kind of digesting them and see if they mean something more than that structure is. Because to be very honest, at that point I was just happy that a system was created and a structure came into existence. I felt that represented Herman Miller, and that was the end of it. I did not think more than that. But now I'm starting to really explore this notion of subjectivity and whether we can then already start to put that in the kind of front loaded into our design process.
In that, because you mentioned something at the moment that you designed a space or a solution without knowing the space, especially for the new location of Extra.
Yeah.
So, because when we look at your practice, we think that you start from the module, and from the module you then design the space.
Yeah.
But actually, after that, when we look at some of the other projects that you did, then you start from the space and you go to the module.
Yeah.
So how do you balance that between almost an inside out and outside in phenomenon?
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe it's utopian in my mind that a space would generate a particular form that is so specific that no other forms can, be as an option, right? So, so to me, it's more about creating context by putting in an object. Especially when I do interior projects, there's really no context whatsoever, no physical context to contend with. So that's why I look to the brand, I look to the processes that the designers took in those brands, and those become my context, right? So I think you pointed out quite accurately that I do not really need that physical space to generate a form, because in the first place, my contexts are intangible and they're not physical. In the reverse, I feel that when I put a form in, it was to create an accident or a conflict or some kind of contrast with something. And so after a few projects, I realized that most of the time, because of my natural tendency to objectify, my products are always an object that can actually be pulled out of any space. And I would be happy that it is kind of be able to exist by itself, independently of its surrounding. Obviously, then after that, I would have to adapt it to other parameters, like other external influences.
And in that, because you're an architect, like TypeO Architecture is also your company.
Yeah.
How do you translate that into architecture? Because when we see your work, we see some similarities with the work, with some of the work of some famous Japanese architects, like Sana, of course, or Fujimoto, and so on. So, like, we can see the potential. Do you see the potential?
Yeah. I because I have running 3 companies, sometimes I'm putting the hats on and off so often that to be honest, I can feel a bit lost. But of late, I'm trying to summarize, right? So almost 8 years now. So I'm trying to summarize, and this was a good opportunity to try to put things into words. I find that actually. I mean, if I can put it simply, I wanted to speak with form and space, and in this case, material. I wanted to say something, and I couldn't say it using words. So, therefore, the process is very important to me, and I would like the entire process to be kind of compressed in the final outcome, that you can almost feel the process as you look at the final object. And I thought that would be interesting to work on for architecture as real buildings, whereby the conversation, people feel ownership if they really truly own the narrative of the site or the building. And that's something that is, to me, that subjective part, which I'm trying to contend with and work towards. How do you truly feel ownership of a space? And can architecture ever provide you that ability to feel true, genuine ownership? Because, like, we all live in, a lot of us live in housing, which are already predetermined for us. How can we have them the freedom to determine how these spaces will be done? And can architecture provide that freedom? So, what would be a non-deterministic architecture be? These are just things that
Those are big questions.
Yeah.
Especially in Singapore context, in a high-density living,
correct.
With like housing that are pretty similar throughout the entire nation. So the contrast is even like more impactful when we see the architecture that is surrounding us, that is so rigid at some point. And when you talk about freedom in architecture, or architecture providing freedom, your architecture provides that. So I believe, I don't know for the audience here, but I think so. And that's why the question that I have is that, does Singapore and the Singapore environment provide you that freedom for you to create, for you to design, and to find an audience that understands that?
Increasingly, yes, and that's why I'm here. The audience is growing. I mean, when I first started, it was very much like a retaliation because, when I just came back from abroad, and then you have some things that you learn abroad and you try to implement it here. Some of them are a bit complex, and then you find that fabricators and contractors are not open to doing things that they have not done before. Then I had nowhere to look for help. In fact, the first Herman Miller project that I did, all the mock-ups were done in London. That's the place I know, and just in that area, there are 5 companies that can provide that mock-up that I need. Whereas here, I would have to pay a lot more. So that's why I created my own little space for us to make mistakes and for us to create experiments. So yeah, I think in Singapore there is freedom provided you are willing to put it in, like put your entire effort into creating it. I think there's always a negotiation with the industry. I mean, it took a while for all these projects to be doing.
And to innovate and to push and to break the boundaries. I'm looking at my phone because there are some questions coming in, so I'm trying to like listen to the answer and also to channel the questions. Actually, there is a question from Anna. So Anna, you are online. Can the installation that you did, can they be installed outside, outdoor? Can they sustain the weather, like the strong tropical rain that we have here, the harsh sun? Like, can that be installed outside?
Yeah. So we actually from some of the systems we have made, we have tried them also in steel and aluminum. So, for example, the basket structure, it can be installed outside. For the timber products, and that's why we are really looking forward to work with mass engineered timber, and particularly reconstituted timber, because it is so highly compressed, so dense that it's almost water resistant. I wouldn't say waterproof yet, but they have been outdoors for a long time, maybe 10 years without much problem. They are also not susceptible so much to termites, to rots. So this becomes an opportunity that I can look at whatever I have done, accumulated in terms of systems, and some of them are really suitable for timber. And then think about it from a building standpoint. You will definitely outdoor and structural. And that's why we are looking into topological optimization. So in preparation for us to build outdoors. So a lot of what we are doing, because when we just started, we are doing things indoor, but we tend to think of them as building within buildings. So yes, they do have a potential to be exported outdoors.
In that, I'm fascinated with what you say and the level of exploration and iteration. You could see that in your presentation. I was talking to some other fellow architects in Singapore that I'm moderating talks, I organize talks, and so of course I talk a lot about architecture, and I was asking about like, who is the most innovative architect in Singapore? And your name came in.
Oh, right.
So, of course, of course, he's at the crossroad between architecture and product and materiality. Do you know that? Do you know that you are considered one of the most innovative architects in Singapore?
No, I mean, other architects, to be really honest, they innovate in many other ways. Some in the social, some in placemaking and all that, which, obviously. Which I look very much towards working in those areas as well. But yes, I feel that I like playing with new tools. I taught myself to script, and made a bunch of German friends who have their pastime as scripting. So they would take a train ride to go hiking, and they would finish a script. And then that was very interesting for me. I was very inspired. So the technological side, I feel, not only helps us with our production. A lot of people fear that they may take over the traditional way in which we produce architecture, but I tend not to think so, because the fundamental questions of architecture it remains unchanged and still relevant. What is changed is the way we produce it. We can make it faster, we can make it more accurate, we can look for new ways to build something, and why not? So the language should be an open source thing. Architectural language is open source, so you can add more vocabularies into it. And finally, you speak a dialect that maybe for a while you understand by yourself, and I think that's okay.
It's interesting because that reminds me of a talk that we had here in Cosentino City, where architect Theodore Chan came here, like one of our former SAE presidents, and he was very provocative in saying that architects will no longer exist in the future because machine will be taking over. Technological tools will be taking over. Of course, he was pushing, he was provocating in this, but your practice is for me a response to that, saying that we can marry craft and strong craft embedded into a strong local cultural context and technological advent. And that's that I appreciate even further the first hut that you designed, and to see how fast forward that became this body of work that is questioning, challenging the materiality, such as timber, and how that can be utilized in a highly futuristic kind of form and shape. So I think we are almost done because it's already an hour. Unless we have from our audience, so for people online, you don't necessarily see, but we have few people with us in the showroom. Do you have any questions here before we wrap up? We can continue discussing after that. So the very last question that I will have, and after I can leave all of you continuing your activities, but education is very important, and you talked about that as well, and you said that you even see yourself as an educator. Where do you teach? What do you teach? Because in Singapore context, we have in US, we have SUTD, Singapore University of Technology and Design. Are you teaching there? Are you teaching at NUS? Or you don't necessarily teach, but you give talks like today? How is your education like?
Yeah, I've been teaching at NUS on and off. Been invited to SUTD for a few trips, but haven't really taught them. But I'm also involved with Polytechnic, where there's that kind of technocratic slant is still kind of mainstream. And I felt that looking at all these different stages of architecture thought or learning helps me also to brush up on what is most relevant in technology and also in architectural thinking. Why do I teach? I teach, I think, primarily to refine my thinking, but also at the same time, I hope to inspire other people to come onto this platform that I've created, which is not so stable. It's like half technology, half architecture, and then I welcome more comments and more people to be involved and challenge these notions. Yeah.
So thanks, Dan. It was a true pleasure to have you with us today, to have you here in Cosentino City. It was a real pleasure. We learned so much today. So I would like to give you a round of applause. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'll just be concluding with Maria. And in the meantime, I would say stay tuned and please join us for the next talk next month. Can I say the name, or you are about to say it? Or?
No, so you can say it.
For the next month, we have Alante from Formworks. It's one of the former architect director, and of course the head and the co-founder of Formworks. So please join us next month for the talk from Alan. And the last word from Maria.
Okay, thank you very much, Han. Thank you for teaching us this new concept. At least for me, it was a new concept, parametric phenomenology. It was very, very, very insightful and very meaningful presentation. So maybe your next installation can be done with Tecton or Silenton. Right. So thank you very much for your audience to be here today. And Yann, as always, thank you for being on our side. Thank you, and see you next May, next month.
Thank you. Bye.